Well, welcome to TIWLT, Thousand Islands Watershed Land Trust. And I can only have this one little time, so I'll put in a plug. I hope that you'll consider joining us in conserving land. It's one of the best ways to mitigate climate change. And it's the only way to save plants and animals. Currently, TIWLT has conserved 5,851 acres. And of that, we have retained 1,769 acres, and we're working on another 3 properties now. So your donations help us acquire that land. A word about our events coming up. There's one more snowshoe hike in February 20th at 1 p.m. And I haven't even decided where to go yet. I like to look and see what the weather is. If it's a really calm, beautiful, sunny day with snow, we'll go up on a lookout. And if it's not, we'll go somewhere else. So you just have to write info@twilt.ca and I will tell you where it is. In March, we're having birding for everyone on Sunday, March 20th with Robert Birch, who's a super birder. And that's at 1 p.m. as well. And he's hoping the ducks will be back and we'll go and see the rafts of ducks.
Nice.
Then on March 22nd, we have the Science Café with Brian Henderson, who's the retired head gardener of Upper Canada Village. He was he worked in the greenhouse industry, propagating trees. He was a teacher at Loyalist College. He's extremely knowledgeable. And he's going to speak on the topic of heritage gardens, both vegetables and flowers. He knows when every plant arrived here and what it was like and how it came. And he can tell you all of that. It's amazing. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Wooding of Ironwood Organics. Chris grows ecological services at Ironwood Organics, and it's TIWLT's pleasure to be partners with him on the Ecological demonstration farm. Chris is working on special research projects, and we do this with the help of the Weston Family Foundation and Dr. and Mrs. Bauta. Chris is a well-known speaker at at organic conferences and various universities, McGill, Queen's, Toronto. And of course, he's a farmer. And he and his wife, Mary, live at Ironwood Organics, and Mary owns Twig and Fleur for her business as well. So you're going to love what he has to say and how he says it. Just try to keep up. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Marnie. Well, welcome everybody. It was nice to see some familiar faces. And for those of you that I don't know, I'm Chris Wooding. I'm late to farming, maybe 10 years ago, from a systems analyst role in telecommunications and geographic information systems. So I come from a background of complex system theory, and it didn't take me long farming to realize that that's exactly what farming in the environment is. It's just a whole bunch of variables that interplay with each other, and farming for me has been A, learning those interdependencies, and B, trying to figure out how I can do less and let nature do her work and make the farm a healthier, better place. So the talk today is the Backyard Planet. It's a new talk that I put together expressly for this. So there's a little bit of dry technical stuff about ecosystems and ecosystem services. And what I've tried to do is take what I observe and practice on the farm and miniaturize it down to the concept of a backyard, so that you can see the parallels. And as we connect 100 backyards, all of a sudden we have a regional area again. So this is an aerial view of our farm. Obviously the left and right are summer and winter. It's south looking. So Charleston Lake are the lakes that you see at the upper. And what might be striking to you about the farm is all the hedgerows. A lot of farms have those taken out. So they're big, huge square fields. And in an average year, we grow probably 90 to 115 different things. Obviously 6 or 7 are at a field scale. And there's an awful lot of research in soybeans and potato breeding. We do wheat breeding. But you can see the adjacent farms to the left and right tend to be in monoculture. They all look the same, so they're growing 1 or 2 things. And it's part of that biodiversity on our farms, I think, that gives it this magic. So when we look at the backyard environment, it's really not scale dependent. You could imagine every one of those fields as being somebody's backyard. And even if it's a small urban backyard with 2 trees and a small plot and a hedgerow of flower beds, it's still an environment, and the edges where the field meets the hedgerow or the grass meets your flower garden, those are called ecotones, and it's the adjacency of 2 sort of different physical environments, and that's where a lot of the life exists. So you can imagine birds in the hedgerow coming out into the field. And then in the evening, as the temperature goes down, the bugs will come out from the forest and into the grassed areas, and bats will come from the roosts into the grassed areas. So there's a lot of interplay between these physical areas. As an individual backyard or an individual field, you can look at them as sort of the concept of sanctuary, especially if they are surrounded by areas that don't have sort of ecosystem services. And imagine 1 out of every 3 backyards being this biodiverse area. And if you aggregate those together, all of a sudden you've got yourself a corridor that wildlife can pass between and pollinators can go between. And it's a huge net positive impact. So we talk about ecosystem services. For those of you that have been to the farm, we have a large billboard and it says, "We grow ecosystem services." So ecosystem are all the things in the environment. Some of them are physical, some of them are flora and fauna, but the services, the interacting of those things provide things for us, quote, for free, and they're only free when the ecosystem is intact. So life support, obviously one of the big ecosystem services that trees and grass and plants provide is the production of oxygen. They filter air, they provide physical environment conditioning in terms of cooling and heating and slowing wind. There's a huge area of climate regulation, and that's one of the things that is beginning to fail in terms of ecosystem services is the carbon balance and what's in the ocean, what's in the soil, and what's in the atmosphere. And we'll touch on that a couple of times today. Pest management, nature doesn't like a vacuum, but nor does it like a monoculture. And when there's one thing, there's no competition. And nature loves competition. And the more things in terms of biodiversity that you can get, then the less the pest management issue is, because everything is in balance. It is this sort of a concept of coevolution, that when everybody evolved together, there's all sorts of predator-prey relationship, and everybody eats everybody, and all the garbage is cleaned up, and the system acts as a balance. So one of the things down the bottom here, this notion of land function versus land use, there's kind of an extractive mentality that the land is for us to use. And in fact, when you look at the provincial level or governments in general, there's land use policies, and all the official plans are how we can use the land. But the land actually has function in and of itself, and depends on the slope of the land and the depth of the soil and bedrock, and even wetlands and things like that. That serves a function. And when the land is functioning properly, it is providing those ecosystem services. And when it gets out of whack, and we'll talk about wetlands a little bit, when the wetlands start going, then the thermal regulation goes, the spring flooding starts happening, soil erosion starts to pick up. So there's a lot of benefit just to think throughout this talk about land functioning. The 4 words at the bottom are my new mantra. Well, new as of a couple of years ago. We store our grain in sea containers, so we're going to try and paint those words on 4 of our sea containers. So next time Google Earth flies overhead, you will see those from space. And they are in order, and the order depends on this ordinality. The first thing is diversity. The more the better, the more species the better, and the more animals and variability within that, the better. And it's only when you hit that critical level of diversity that you get stability. So you can imagine a one-legged pogo stick versus a two-legged ladder versus a three-legged stool versus a 100-leg stool. And the greater the diversity, the more stable that system is. And when I say stable, it means that it's not easily pushed over. So it can affect some of these, diurnal aspects and some of the climate change mitigation. And it tends to be repeatable and predictable. The next sort of developmental thing is this notion of resiliency. So all of a sudden we're getting, 100-year storms. Well, now we're getting 1,000-year storms, but we're getting 3 of them, in a decade. So there's a notion of how we can be resilient within that environment and withstand periodic droughts, periodic flash floods, periodic high winds and tornadoes and things. And when that event passes, the better the resiliency, the quicker we return to stability. And ultimately, the goal is sustainability. And there's a notion of being able to do it forever. And part of that sustainability needs what I call ecological capital. So when I give talks at ag conferences, which have a lot of younger people there, I give them the paradigm of having $1 million for them. And when they're born, I'll give them $1. When they're 1, I give them 2. When they're 2, I give them 4. When they're 4, I give them 8. So there's a doubling cycle. And the hypothetical question is, when are they going to run out of money? And a lot of them think when they're 60 or 70. And it turns out when they're 23, I think, they've spent $560,000 and they have 1 doubling cycle left. So when they're 24, they're broke. And the antithesis of that is having $1 million and investing it in a trust fund and being able to live on a $60,000 salary for your entire life and die a millionaire. And if you replace money with ecosystem services and ecological capital, I think this is kind of where we are, that it looks like there's a land of plenty, but in fact, we've been through our $500,000 in ecosystem services, and we have 1 doubling cycle left. So this is, the urgency that, and I see it too. I hear it in the news. I hear the UN, the climate reports and IPCC reports, and I think it just can't possibly be that imminent when you look around and see all the beautiful lakes and rivers, and especially here on the Thousand Islands. But we are 1 doubling cycle away from that catastrophic thing. So we're going to try and get within an hour here. So 10 after. So a little bit of fact here. So soil is really the hinge pin to all of this. Dead soil is dirt. Live soil, which includes a huge amount of biodiversity that we'll talk about. It has various particle sizes, coarse, fine. Silt is obviously something that's really, really fine and comes out as sort of mud. But a healthy soil will actually act as a carbon sink, and we'll talk about that, how we can do that in the backyard and vegetable gardens. It also provides nutrient reserves. So rather than fertilizing all the time, there's biota in the soil, which can actually create those nutrients by breaking down rocks. And a healthy soil is about 60% air. So it's absolutely critical. And when you think about it, you and I, and look to your partner that's sitting beside you, we're made of soil. Everything that's in our bodies started in the soil and moved through the soil, the mycelium network, into the roots of a plant, into a plant, and from the plant into us, or the plant into an animal into us. But everything that we are made of, all the calcium in our bones and our fingertips and stuff like that, it all comes from soil. So it makes sense that soil is our sort of number one thing that we're looking to create that diversity in. One of the things that I've just been absolutely astounded at in this farming exercise, we've been at it maybe 15 years now, and for me, a field was this 2-dimensional surface. And you look across the field and you can see how the crops were growing. And as I started to understand the subsoil activities in terms of these root exudates and fungi and all the symbionts and stuff like that, I realized that the field isn't 2-dimensional, but rather 3-dimensional and goes down 2 or 3 feet into the subsoil. And then when you start looking at the hedgerows and the birds and trees and canopies and the effects on winds and stuff like that, the environment all of a sudden becomes this huge 3-dimensional space that maybe 400 feet up into the atmosphere and down into the subsoil. And at every level in that verticality, there are elements and organisms, and they all have these ecosystem roles. So looking around this in a counterclockwise direction, as plants die, they leave this litter, and we'll talk about litter later on. and they will break that litter down into fragmentation. These goes into the graders, and these are things like worms and arthropods. And eventually they go down into the very basic elements. And this is part of what carbon sequester is. It's a chemical called glomalin, which is a waterproof chemical that stays in the soil for almost 40 years. And this is really the foundation for all this stuff you hear in the news about regenerative ag. It is getting that carbon from the atmosphere into the plant and get that under the soil where it's incorporated. So when you look in your backyard, this notion of the lawn, quote unquote, and the ecotones where the lawn meets your flower gardens, or your pool deck, or the adjacent forests and things. There are xerophyte gardens, which are low water usage gardens. You can imagine when you're in an urban environment and you irrigate the lawn, you're actually irrigating it with chlorinated water, which pretty much kills everything in the subsoil and turns your soil back to dirt. So the less dependent we are on irrigation, the cheaper your water bill, obviously. But it ends up encouraging that soil system to act as an integrated, self-monitoring, self-managing system. So the notion of leaving your grass clippings, don't pick them up, leave your leaf litter, don't rake that. So a white clover understory in your grass and leave your grass long at 2 inches, and all that moisture that would traditionally evaporate off will now stay in the soil, and you don't need to irrigate, and your grass will become more healthier, and the adjacent thing along the ecotones into your flower beds and into the adjacent trees will also improve. This notion of soil restoration, we've lost an awful lot of soil over the years. Some of it is due to compaction, which is getting the life and the carbon out of the soil so it compacts into a heavy, almost a concrete. And one of the downsides to that is that oxygen can't get in there. And when oxygen is not in there, all the aerobic respiration goes anaerobic. And the byproduct of anaerobic respiration is acid. So your soil becomes acidic. And this is, you can see in unhealthy lawns, you get this huge moss bed, and then you start spreading lime. So a lot of that is the cycle that we're setting up through soil compaction. To reverse that by getting organic matter back into the soil, and there's a key line here across the middle, that the 1% of organic matter is about 20,000 gallons of rainfall per acre, which is about an inch. So tomorrow, if you're south of Highway 7, we're expecting to get over 40 millimeters of rain. So that's a classic climate change driven rain event. And if the ground wasn't frozen solid and you had an extra 1% organic matter in your backyard, all of that rain would simply fall in your backyard and stay there. It wouldn't run off, it wouldn't fill the ditches, it wouldn't overwhelm the sewer systems. So this notion of restoring soil is really foundational in restoring the organic matter in soils. So when we lose that carbon, it only generates about 1 centimeter a century. So the carbon loss has been from 12% to 2.5%, 3% most farm fields. And most of that carbon is actually in the atmosphere right now. And as it precipitates out of the atmosphere, it dissolves into the ocean. And this is part of the whole ocean acidification that's happening. And it's not that the ocean is an acid yet, it is still alkaline, but it is moving up the pH scale, and it is no longer alkaline enough that some of the seashells and crustaceans and stuff can actually build their shells now. So it's a really dangerous thing. Imagine if we lose our fisheries in the oceans, what that would do to global food supplies. So this recarbonizing of the soil also reduces the runoff, simply because it's making the water back, or making the soil back to be a sponge. So when we look at that, this is a video that was taken underneath the Highway 32 rail bridge. And on my left, your left, I guess, as well, the dirty part is actually runoff from farmers' fields that were left bare. And on the right, it's the fresh stuff that's come across grass fields and through forests. And you can actually follow this line all the way out into the St. Lawrence River. And a lot of this dirt is farmland dirt, and it's ending up on the backside of the Cornwall hydroelectric dams. So it's quite a thing. So wetlands are the other huge piece of this backyard ecosystem. doesn't necessarily affect you directly because it's not in your backyard. But if you think of the backyard being in the sort of 1,000 acre, 10,000 acre proximity, then it really becomes a critical thing. A lot of our wetlands have been gone, since first contact. One of the huge ecosystem services that wetlands provide is when you get spring runoff and you get these crazy events like tomorrow, where it's going to be +6 and we're going to lose 2 feet of snow, and it's going to rain 2 inches and the ground is frozen solid. So 100% of that moisture is probably going to run off the land. So, you should be expecting river flooding and whatnot. Had the wetlands been intact, most of that water would be slowed down into the wetlands, at which point it becomes, part of that water budget, and a lot of the water will percolate down and replenish replenish the aquifers. And as it drains off, it will slowly replenish the creeks over the course of weeks or months. So this notion here, I did a talk up in Grey Bruce early in January, and I showed a picture of a dust bowl, and it was actually in December in Kansas, and it looked so similar to the dust bowl in the 1930s. And this notion that deserts aren't the result of a lack of water, but it's the lack of water that creates deserts. And the whole desertification of land is really a function of mucked up water budgets, and a lot of that water budget is because of wetlands. So the wetland ecosystem services, tourism, groundwater recharging, medicines, habitat, fish habitat, flood mitigation is absolutely huge, because the fewer the wetlands, the greater the downstream mitigation. And this is a real compounding thing with climate change, because we're getting fewer rain events, but when it does rain, it just rains cats and dogs, and the accumulation of runoff water is causing this flood. So since the 1800s, this is a chilling diagram. We've lost the dark purple areas. We've lost, 85 to 100% of the wetlands. So you can argue that any wetland that's left is absolutely critical, because we're down to the last 15%. So back to that, notion of having $1 million, and we're halfway through our wealth capital, our capital wealth. And in this scenario, we're 75% through it. So, it's critical we don't lose more wetlands, and it's important that we begin to restore them. This is a wetland off Google Earth, lets you scroll back through time with the satellite images. And this is a wetland complex, August 3rd, 2014. Here it is 1 year later. And you can see there's probably been a drain cut in this dam, and a lot of this has been draining out. You can start to see this is not looking nearly as healthy as the year before. And then here we are 6 years later, and all the phosphate loading and blue-green algae buildup, and it's just not a healthy environment whatsoever. And you can imagine in 5 years on, 10 years on, this will simply dry out and cease to be functioning as a wetland. So our wetland behind our farm was drained out, and we lost probably 2.5 feet of water. And there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of frogs through here. We lost most of our bats. We lost most of our dragonflies, and with the dragonflies gone, they ate the horseflies. So we have a huge, deer fly, horsefly population, and so it's just sent this huge ripple through the ecosystem. And most importantly, this is the map of our wells. Ministry of the Environment has this public data, and every green dot is somebody's registered well. It's just in this view. So there's Charleston Lake in the middle. We're down here tonight on Hill Island. It goes across to Sand Lake and out past Brockville, I think is through here, Jones Falls. And there's Mallorytown. So just in that small area, there's 12,000 wells. And I'm sure everybody has heard somebody that's wells ran dry during one of the last dry periods, 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the ways of recharging that aquifer is the restoration of wetlands. Back to our diversity, stability, resiliency, sustainability, this notion of instability and unpredictable is what we're seeing with climate change. And ultimately, it's a heat issue. And when it gets too hot, wind is actually a function of the delta in temperature. So when there's a hot air mass and a cold air mass, and they slide past each other, that's what creates these winds. And again, tomorrow is a classic example. It was -34 this morning, and it's +6 tomorrow, which is just mind-boggling. And with that, are going to be coming these 70, 80 kilometer winds. The drought and precipitation model is also changing. changing. Rather than predictable rain, once every 3 to 4 days, we're getting these long drought periods, and the ground dries out and bakes off, and then we get an average amount of precipitation, but we get it in one day, and that's getting all this erosion and soil erosion and runoff. As a farmer, I'm acutely aware that we literally have one growing season per year. So my analogy when I give talks to farm groups is, imagine you're a baker and you're only allowed to bake bread once a year, and you don't have control over the oven temperatures. And the other analogy in the brewing crowd is that you're only allowed to brew one huge, 200,000 hectoliter batch of beer, but you don't have control of the yeast or the wort temperature. So that's literally how precarious our food system is that as a farmer, the only thing I can really decide on, other than what to grow, is when to plant it and when to harvest it. And everything in the middle is a complete crapshoot. Not a crapshoot, but you know what I mean. So when you look in the microclimates in the backyard, one of the things that we noticed up at the farm as we were walking around is the healthiest parts of the farm were the ones that were tucked in these little ecological niches. So trees and hedgerows are an absolute foundation to this creation of microclimates. If they're about 40% dense, they actually slow the wind, so you can get this howling wind coming from the west, and the kinetic energy of the wind actually is absorbed in moving the trees. And on the lee side, it's actually quite calm. And during the winter, this increases snow deposition, so you actually accumulate moisture on the lee side of your hedgerows, which protects and keeps the soil warm. Frost actually thaws from the bottom up. So by keeping a nice snow layer on top, there's less frost in the ground. As that moisture that's in the ground evaporates during the summer, you actually get a transpirative cooling effect, so built-in air conditioning. And in a deciduous tree hedgerow, you're getting some shade during the summer and then passive solar gain during the winter. So you can actually architect your backyard, especially if you're south-facing, to get a lot of shade and cooling during the summer and get that beautiful winter sun pouring through your windows. The organic matter in the soil has roughly the same sorts of effects. It encourages that decompaction. It stores more moisture, so you're getting less runoff in these catastrophic rains, but it also sort of sweats and cools, and it's no different than us. When we sweat and our moisture evaporates from our body, that evaporation, that state transition of water, is the thing that makes us cool, and it will literally cool your backyard. And then the leaf litter that is, either in the lawn with grass clippings or in the adjacent areas with leaves from last year's fall, that creates these tiny, tiny microcosms and microclimates underneath, above the soil and below the leaf litter. So aggregated together, so we're going up high into the canopy of the trees and all the way down to the subsoil, you've got all these little microhabitats that all the flora and fauna can exist within. And I think one of the biggest and the biggest unseen is that ground litter and detritus cycle, where all your leaves are breaking down. And that's where we get our burrowing mammals, ground nesting bees, and it's absolutely critical to those spring ephemerals. So your spring ramps, your trilliums, and a lot of the wild gingers and things like that, they're absolutely dependent on having that leaf litter. And if you go into an undisturbed forest, that leaf litter literally lasts until the end of August, early September, before you start to see some soil spots. And 2 weeks later, it's replaced with the fall leaf cutting. So that's sort of the end of the technical bits, and we're going to go through some pictures from the farm, and we're going to try and tie a lot of these concepts together. So mammals, birds, and insects are your three sort of main groups. Insects being one of the absolutely foundational ones, because they are the pollinators. They are also food for birds, and they also eat each other and keep the relative pest loads down. So the bats are eating mosquitoes, and the dragonflies are going to be eating your horseflies. So there's a lot of predator-prey relationships, and this goes back to that initial concept I said, that if you have high levels of diversity and high levels of population density per diversity, then you also have high levels of predator-prey relationships, and everything is down at a dull roar. So you're not getting these huge blooms of mosquitoes or deer flies. So insects are one of the critical things because they involve all aspects of the microclimate. They go subsoil. Some of them are flyers, some of them are crawlers. The one down at the bottom here is just a parasite. It's an American oil beetle. It's lost its ability to fly, and it lays its eggs in bumblebees. And the left side here, bottom left corners, are 9-spotted ladybird, which is now on the endangered list thanks to the Japanese beetle that's come in. Dragonflies are remarkable hunters. They're everything that gets hunted. And I think this is true. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but everything that gets hunted is in this chasing. You see a dog chasing a squirrel, or everything with the exception of the dragonfly. And the dragonfly actually sees where the prey is flying, and it calculates the trigonometric tangent, and it literally flies diagonally and runs an intercept course on its prey. So it's just millions of years of evolution. Part of having all these backyards connected is this notion of a connectivity track. And I stumbled on this article from last year, and the UK is actually creating this beeline, an intersection of superhighways. So creating this contiguous backyard garden so that as insects migrate, then the birds that come in, the songbirds and stuff that are coming up from the Caribbean, they have food supplies, and everybody can migrate up. And as the season changes and heat comes up and days get longer, so does the blooming season. So as insects start to move north, they will move from one flower bloom to the next flower bloom and ultimately get to their northern reaches. So it's another interesting way of thinking of your backyard. Birds are critical. Some of them are resident, like the grouse up here. This is our famous bobolinks. This is a field nested bird that's also on the endangered species list. It overwinters down in the Caribbean and Cuba. They tend to come back to the same fields that they were fledged in the year before. So if you have standing hay and you don't take off hay early, you will actually get an increase in bobolinks population year over year. This is an American bittern. We took great care in trying to get the picture and figure out what the heck it was. And then we figured out it was an American bittern, and part of its defense strategy is to stick its beak towards the sky and freeze. And once we learned that, we got the camera and literally walked back out into the field within sort of 3 or 4 feet of it, and tried not to disturb it that much, but took a couple of great shots and then came back. So this is a migratory GIS map. Each light represents a tagged bird, and it's of Northern Europe coming down into Spain. So it's a winter migration. And once they get to the destinations, you can see the amazing amount of back and forth. And obviously they are feeding and energizing to get their next leg of the migration. And this works both coming north in the spring in the next couple of months, as well as returning. So the backyard woodlands, this woodland is near and dear to me, partly because of the physical ecosystem services in terms of wind mitigation and shade. The litter is absolutely critical as well. And something we've been doing a lot of research in conjunction with the Land Trust is bat research. And bats need to drop like 4 or 5 feet before they can take off. So open woodland canopy are absolutely critical for the diurnal roosts of bats. So when they take off in the evening, they have that glide path. And something else that we had done some research with, we actually found an arborist manual for woodland management. And it turns out that different species of songbirds occupy different areas of the forest canopy for perching, for nesting, and for feeding. So you might get one species of warbler that nests high in the tree canopy. It perches and sings in the mid layers, but it feeds down on the ground. And then another bird might nest down near the bottom. It might do its mating and calling high in the tree canopy and feed on insects somewhere in the mid latitude. So you get this vertical distension of your tree canopies. And this is, again, part of that biodiversity that nature doesn't like a vacuum, and it takes all these little niches, and there's tons of specialization in there. We talked about the spring ephemerals, the existence of all these ramps, which are spring leaks, and trilliums, and there's a whole cornucopia of stuff that comes out in the forest, and all of that is 100% dependent on that leaf litter. So stop raking your leaves. That's my public service message today. Don't rake your leaves. Underneath that leaf litter, this was a log that we kicked over when we do some of our fallen tree and our dead tree cleanup in the hedgerows, especially with ash and elm. We are starting to leave the stumps in the forest as these little hybiculums and stuff, and we kicked one over by accident, and this lovely little blue spotted salamander was under it. But you can see up in the top right-hand corner here, all the fungi and the mycelium networks that are breaking down all that sort of stuff. And this is part of that organic matter in the soil rebuilding. And as that leaf litter begins to decompose, animals, earthworms, arthropods, they will get pulled down into the subsoil. This is a lovely image of I can't quite remember the name of this moth, but you see it's camouflaged against beech trees and stuff like that. But what's startling in this image, if you look around at all these tiny little black smudges, they're springtails. And we'll start to see them just in the next couple of days in the snow. And a lot of people refer to them as snow fleas. And it's actually a remarkable story behind them. They actually, literally, their tail curves under, much like a crayfish, and then they spring. And I think there was 16 G-forces or something. It's just remarkable what they're doing. This is the leaf litter again, so you can see them jumping all of a sudden, ping, and they're just complete random where they land. But I stumbled on this report that claimed that the eastern white pines are carnivorous. So I used to live in British Columbia, and it was common knowledge out there that a lot of the nitrogen isotopes that are in the old growth forests are actually ocean isotopes. And they've traced the cycle of nitrification from the salmon that are out in the oceans, and they absorb all the nitrogen in their bodily proteins. They come upstream to spawn. The grizzly bears eat and black bears eat the salmon and take them sort of 30, 40 meters into the forest. And then the blowflies and maggots get into the carcass, and they go further inland. And when all that biota dies to the forest floor and decomposes, the trees actually take them up and make tree tissue out of it. And you can actually trace the nitrogen isotopes that are ocean isotopes in the firs. And we find exactly the same thing here in the eastern white pines. On granitic soil, there's not a ton of nitrogen. And there's a relationship between the pine tree and this fungus down here, the Laccaria bicolor. And when the tree is short of nitrogen, you ready for this? The tree gives root exudates, which are things that it exudes from its roots, sugars and whatnot, to feed the fungi and the mycelium network in the subsoil. And part of that message, and I'm not sure exactly how the message is, but it says it needs nitrogen, and the Laccaria bicolor fungi actually releases a gas which creates the makes the springtails go inert, and the bacteria comes up and dissolves them, eats them, transports that nitrogen across it, and they can actually map nitrogen levels from the springtails into the eastern white pines. So again, you need all those things to exist: a healthy subsoil, you need the subsoil mycelium, you need that leaf litter, you need the springtails, you need the eastern white pines, and that whole ecosystem. And that's just 4 things that are functioning together and have been for millennia. So a huge thing is this, what I call the microscopic backyard, and more I'm understanding that most of our farm, in terms of weight, in terms of individual organisms, and in terms of ecosystem services, is actually below grade. It's under the soil. If you had a tablespoon of healthy soil, a handful, there would be more organisms in that handful than there are people on the planet. And you can imagine how many handfuls of healthy soil we have. So it's absolutely remarkable the amount of organisms that are in the soil. They break down and recycle all the dead organic matter. This is part of the nutrient cycling. And again, back to a decompacted soil and water runoff. If the soil is compacted and it rains heavily, that dead organic matter is going to run horizontally into our lakes. And that was an example of that phosphorus loading in the wetlands that were all green with blue-green algae. But if the soil is healthy, that rain and the dead organic matter is going to be brought down into the subsoil. It's going to be carbon sequestered out of the atmosphere. It's going to then transfer old nutrients into new plants. And when we're growing our wheats, we rarely bale our straw, and all that straw and all the waxy cuticles on it are literally a slow release fertilizer. So all the nutrients that the plant mopped up this season are going to be broken down next season. And now we have this beautiful cyclical nutrient cycle. So out of that huge vertical hay field or wheat field that's 3.5 feet tall and 2 feet underground, we're just taking off 4 inches of the wheat heads, and all the rest of it goes back into that environment. And the 2 critical players are mycorrhizal fungi, and these are fungi that move nutrients between plants and aid in interplant communication. That's how trees communicate to each other and move nutrients and sugars between each other. And the other one is a rhizobia bacteria that gets inside of roots, and it actually does atmospheric nitrogen fixing, but it tends to only be on the legumes. So your bush beans and pole beans and soybeans, but most of the legumes have this rhizobia nitrogen fixing bacteria. So wheat and clovers are one of the legumes. So we actually grow a clover as an understory under our wheat, and the wheat's taking nitrogen out of the soil, but at the same time, the clover is fixing atmospheric nitrogen back into the soil. So next year, there's nitrogen available. And there's actually, I was just on a conference in Oxford, England last week, and there's some research programs over there in continuous grain cropping. So rather than doing a 5 or a 7 year rotation, we actually grow wheat year after year after year in the same field. And we get this beautiful nutrient cycling that the clover understory fixes the nitrogen, the plant takes the nitrogen, we harvest the wheat seed, all that straw gets broken back down, increase the soil organic matter, it gets broken down next year. And because of that cycling, as long as there's genetic diversity within the wheats, it literally looks like we can go into a permaculture in a wheat model. And all we do is we go in the fall and seed it, and then go back a year later and harvest it. So to be a remarkable, change from conventional agriculture. These are lichens, and if everyone remembers high school biology, and we learned about symbiosis, where 2 organisms mutually benefit each other. And for 100 years, we've known that lichens are in fact blue-green algae and a fungi. And literally in 2016, we figured out that there's also a Brasidomyces, a yeast, that's part and parcel of that 2-way symbiosis, and there's actually 3 ways. So this is what you're seeing here on the slide is the very beginnings of soil formation. So the rock is there, and these lichens are actually creating acid areas, and they're breaking down the rocks into nutrients. And the blue-green algae is photosynthesizing into sugars and giving the sugars to the fungi in exchange for the minerals. The fruiting bodies, the mushrooms, as we know them, are at the end of a fungi's life cycle. So the fungi will grow and grow and grow, and as it gets to the end of its nutrient resources, it'll pop up and create these fruiting bodies. So imagine an apple tree growing underground, and then as it runs out of energy and stuff, all of a sudden all these apples start popping out of the ground. So some of these are just are enormous in size. These are giant puffballs, and some of the fungal colonies, might be 15, 20,000 linear kilometers long. Because they're microscopic, there will be hundreds and hundreds of hyphae strands within, underneath your foot in the soil. But it's a remarkable amount of diversity. And generally, most of them are decomposers. So their sole job is to take trees, fallen trees, and dead organic matter and break it down and free up those nutrients and pass them into new living tissues. So here's an example of a Tinder Polypore. And what first attracted me to this, or the first cool thing I learned about it, was that Ötzi the Iceman, do you remember in Austria, probably maybe 5-6 years ago, there was a man that appeared because of climate change, and the ice caps were beginning to melt, and they found an Austrian man that was like perfectly preserved, dehydrated. Well, in his leather pouch, he had these Tinder Polypores, and they're actually an amazing fire starter because they're so dense in starches. And they are one of the few fungi that actually act as a parasite as well as a decomposer. And you can tell, so you look at this one that's in the center, the larger one, and it is actually pointing to the bottom of the tree. So it would have been a parasitizer in that role. And then as it fell to the ground, the second fungi, which is closer to the ground, would have then sprouted its fruiting body. And it's always facing the ground in terms of gravity to disperse its spores. So it's a rare event that you see these two polypores, one in a parasitic role, and the other in a decomposing role. So this was just the mushrooms from a field walk. I don't eat many because I don't know them, and there's an old expression that there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, and rarely are they the same person. So we certainly eat the morels, we eat the giant puffballs, and we eat the lion's mane, which was that beautiful, go back to up in the top right-hand corner here, just a lovely fungus that tastes a little bit like shellfish of all things. And, there's some of the wild yeast. So sourdough cultures come from grain, and the grain has bran on it, and the bran has all these wild yeasts. And you simply add water to it, make flour and add water, and you can get a sourdough culture. So we were having difficulty with bread at the farm because it was so cold, the farmhouse. And I had the crazy idea of taking a rubbing off a birch tree, and this works on aspens as well. So you can see all the white powder on my hand. Well, that's yeast. It's wild native yeast, and we simply mixed it with some water and a bit of flour and fed it for 2 or 3 days. And now we have a birch bark wild yeast sourdough. And the remarkable thing is it's actually a cold weather sourdough, and it's really, really active when the house is sort of 65, 66 Fahrenheit. And as you get into the summer, it doesn't like the warm temperatures. And beer is another one. These are Bacillomyces, which is the yeast that is in that symbiotic relationship in the lichens. And we have a partnership with Dominion City Brewery in Ottawa, and they actually came out with sterilized wort. So when you make beer and boil all the sugars, you get something called wort, which is before you add the yeasts to it. And they brought out, I think, 20 jars, and we set them out over the farm overnight, half of them, and the other half we actually went and took flowering bodies that had been visited by multiple pollinators and put the flower right inside the wort. And this is one of the yeasts that they extracted, and it's become one of their house yeasts. They worked with Escarpment Labs down in Niagara, and I think they found, I'm going to say 39 different strains of yeast just in the environment at large. So it's absolutely remarkable. Again, sight unseen, right? The microscopic backyard. So this is a good summary diagram of plants, solar gain, right? This is the epitome of solar energy. Goes into the roots with the organic matter. The organic matter gets broken down by fungi and bacteria. And now you start to see this predator-prey relationship that the nematodes feed the roots, and they eat the arthropods, but the arthropods are eaten by other arthropod predators. Fungi are eaten by nematodes. The protozoa eat the bacteria. They're eaten by nematodes. They're eaten by arthropods. The arthropods eat the birds. And you look up this notion of a trophic level, and you probably remember this from high school biology as well. It's always in this pyramid, and you get multiple first level trophic layers, and the higher up the trophic cascade you get, the fewer and fewer organisms. And the ones that are at the top of that trophic, the 5th level and higher, are your apex predators. So your polar bears, the orcas, lions, bears, animals that don't have other predators on them. So the danger of this whole web is there's 2 things. If you take away a top predator, then you end up with this ecological release, because it's the birds that keep the arthropods in place. It's the dragonflies that keep the deer flies in check. And if you remove the dragonflies, then there's no natural predator for the second layer in the trophic cascade, and they just start to explode. And the opposite is true as well, that if you reintroduce bacteria, reintroduce nematodes, reintroduce one of these elements, then you will actually see this huge cascade. So the 2 things is taking away a peak predator, and the other is adding a apex predator back. And one's called trophic cascade, and the other's called ecological release. Really, really neat stuff. So nature on the move. Nature's not static. We looked at that beautiful animation of the migrating birds, and like everything is on the move all the time, and their habitats tend to be much bigger. There was a really neat wolf GPS collar animation, but I couldn't find it. And it had collars in 3 wolf packs over 3 years. And it was just this huge zigzag, and they never crossed into each other's territories. And it was absolutely remarkable to see this segmentation of their environment. So deer moving through the woods in the same area. There are turkeys and ravens through the woods. We've seen tracks. Mary and I, when we've been out for winter walks for this fishermen, they walk in this crazy sort of oblique pattern down into the wetland all the way back, and they're doing their hunting route. And then you can see the coyotes here in this photograph, and they're all spread out. You know, they're trying to pick up scent from the deer, and are quite amazing the stuff that's going on in the backyard, especially when we're not looking at it. And I realized that 90% of our, you know, ecology at the farm is invisible to us, because generally by the time we get there, the animals have disappeared. You know, periodically we see our resident porcupine, but for the most part, we don't see a lot of wildlife, except when we put up game cameras, and all of a sudden the whole farm comes to life. So the other thing is this notion of nature at night. One of the biggest ecosystem services is turning out your lights. It's absolutely remarkable the amount of nocturnal animals we see at the barn. You know, bats, owls, whippoorwills. There's a whole slew of moths that only, you know, mate at night. Fireflies, raccoon, fishers, and the presence of backyard lights really affects, you know, moth breeding. And if there are no moths, then the bat population suffers. So one of the neatest things we can do is start turning off our lights in the evenings. It's just a remarkable sort of benefit. Marnie, how are we doing for time? 5 to 8?
Yes.
I have
Yes.
two stories that are 5 minutes each. So I'll just do one of them. I'll do the Monarch story, and then we'll wrap things up. So Monarchs, everybody loves them. We seem to get some good years and then some bad years. I don't think they're long to be on the endangered list. Their sole food is milkweed, and they originated down in the Andes, and the milkweed moved up in elevation as the snow melted, and the monarchs followed that milkweed up. And then as the last glacier retreated, the milkweed started moving north, and that's what we get now. So the monarchs live exclusively on milkweed, and in Ontario, milkweed is on the noxious weed. It was illegal to have milkweed in your field from the province, and now that it's off, we're starting to see a little bit more milkweed, but there's nowhere near enough, given that it's the exclusive food of the monarchs. The egg that's laid on the monarch plant, the caterpillar stays on that plant for its entire, you know, pre-chrysalis stage. Then the caterpillar wanders off to form a chrysalis, pupates into a butterfly, and then it flies back to the same plant. It knows the plant that it was born on, or that it fed up as a caterpillar. So during the summer, there's multiple generations. There's not a long lifespan, but the last generation that hatches in September, they're the ones that survive, and they migrate all the way back to Mexico, and they overwinter on a 2-3 hectare site. It's absolutely remarkable. And then it takes 3 generations to return the following spring. Well, this is the caterpillar eating milkweed, and you know, milkweed's got that strange white sticky milk, and the pollen's in it as well. And one of the things that we've learned this is the University of Michigan, is that there's a chemical in the milkweed called cardinaloids, and that is the thing that makes the caterpillar toxic. And there's also parasites, and the higher the level of cardinaloids, the higher the resistance of the parasite is that the caterpillar has. And it turns out that the female monarchs, when they're laying eggs, can selectively detect levels of cardinaloids in the milkweed and selectively plant lay their eggs on those plants. So they're literally self-medicating. And the latest bit of research I found is that the higher the levels of CO2, there's actually a reduction in the cardinaloid levels as well, which means that the monarchs will have less and less resistance to the parasites and also to predation. We just watched that little video again. We tried this for almost a year. And originally we did it in slow motion, thinking the whole process was going to take a month of Sundays, but this is actual real time. Mary was there to witness it. I was out on the tractor, but it literally happened in the course of 30 seconds. It's absolutely remarkable. And then the monarch will pump its wings. It'll climb up and get onto the limb and dry its wings off, and then it's gone. It's absolutely a remarkable story. So one of the things that was in the press last year was an advice against raising monarchs in captivity. We were kind of looking at developing a monarch breeding program where we would actually put a mesh net over a monarch on the milkweed and kind of trick them into planting or laying 6 or 7 eggs on the same plant, and then bringing those inside. And once they're hatched, we will feed them milkweed leaves every day, so we get 100%. I'm not sure the morbidity, but I think there was ranging up to 75 or 80% of all caterpillars get eaten by birds. So anyway, yeah, so there was a research paper that was advising against this because they seem to have lost their ability to navigate. They can't, determine north and south, and they've lost their means to get back to Mexico. And 2 weeks later, there was another paper that was studied, and it turns out that the butterflies need to locate themselves. And there was actually a study where they captured butterflies in arbitrarily say southern Ontario, and they flew them over to Washington, D.C. And the next day, they sort of started flying due south towards Cuba. And within a day and a half, they just switched and they headed straight towards Mexico. So there's something that's absolutely remarkable in them genetically. So these are 4 generations later. So imagine you going back to the cabin that your great grandparents lived in and being able to find it on the little 6-hectare site in the middle of Mexico. And I have a theory as well that if you have a stable milkweed supply at this end, the better the milkweed supply, the better the soil, the higher the carnotinoids, the higher the survivability, and the lower the morbidity. Therefore, you are actually breeding a stronger population with more offspring. And if the monarchs can actually navigate back to Mexico on their own volition, why can't they encode your backyard or your farm as a stable food support? And there's a remote chance that the monarchs that come back to your backyard are offspring of the ones that were born there, hatched there the year prior. There's a great book called The Hidden Life of Trees. And this is a quote, I think, on the inside cover. And as a farm guy, it really appeals to me. So a lot of that book is on the mycelium connection and the communication between trees and plants. So the reason trees share food and communicate is that they need each other. It takes a forest to create a microclimate suitable for tree growth and sustenance. Perhaps the saddest of all plants are those we enslave in our agricultural systems. And I would include backyards to that as well, front lawns. Perhaps farmers can learn from the forests and breed a little more wildness back into their grain and potatoes, so they will be more talkative in the future. And I've sort of taken this one further, and rather than breeding wilding into them, I'm untaming them. Because I think there's this inherent knowledge in nature of what it needs. And the less we do, the more nature will pick up her sticks and do what she knows to do best. This was the worst weather we've seen on the farm. It was a huge umbrella cloud on the left, and my niece painted this for Christmas for me a few years ago, and it really captures that spooky electrical power in the air. If you're like me, you go through bouts of I don't know if it's depression or melancholia or giving up. What's the purpose? You still see oil and gas. We're still buying pipelines. We've known about anthropogenic climate change since 1972. When carbon levels were at 200, and then when I was at school, like can't go above 300. 300 is an absolute highest level, and now we're just soaring past 415, 420. What we have today in terms of climate is baked in for at least 300 years. So it's going to be 2,350 before we get back to sort of where we are today, even if we do something today. But, you know, I see other people doing really, really neat things. So this notion of hope, it's inside me. I think I was ill last year, and having survived that, I am absolutely filled with hope again. It's great to be alive. And I'm kind of attacking things with renewed vigor, and this notion of hope being between us as well. And as we form a community of environmentalists, of activists, of farmers, of backyard gardeners, you know, there's an enormous amount of strength in that, and that strength in people will form that connective tissue. And diversity. You know, I looked at the number of pictures at the beginning of the presentation, and it's remarkable, the different walks of life. And, you know, you're all brought to the Land Trust to learn about things and have that deep curiosity. And I think that the diversity within us is going to be part of our strength. So final thought, we're climate pioneers. The only difference between us as pioneers and the indigenous land people that were, or the land that was taken when the pioneers came, is climate. You know, they had an intact ecosystem, and we don't have an ecosystem. So as pioneers, I think that we are literally in the age of restoration and you know, reviving the land to its former glory. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much.